Okay, well, I'm happy to be on this show, and it has been a long time coming, because I guess for the past 20 years I followed the topic of evolution in integral literature and Wilber's statements on that topic. Yeah, I've grown. I've taken another route than most integralists here, especially when the integral initiative started called evolutionary around 2007 or 8. Then I really dropped off because I had come to different conclusions about the integral view of evolution. And the irony is that it gave me a field of study back, evolutionary theory itself, which was as rewarding to me as the integral project was in the past. So I'm not complaining.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I think part of this discussion will be on Eros, and partly will be on just the general relationship between integral thinking and evolution, and then a little bit of it will be about what Frank's position in the community, if that's even meaningful phrase, might be. But I think there is a perception some people have that Frank is a reductionist, obsessive, orange meme wacko arguing against the straw man version of Ken Wilber. That's not really a fair position as far as I can tell. But Frank also makes this complaint that Wilber's arguing against the strong version of Darwinism or naturalism in general. And so I'm really interested in that kind of double straw man situation. I think there's something there that's useful for the community, if there's a community to take a look at and explore through. I see Frank as, in my view, he's continuing his same area of interest, what I can tell, right, of a progressive, evolution-oriented, multi-dimensional way of making sense of the world with as much validity and rigor and nuance as possible. My impression is that's what attracted him to integral, and my impression is that's what he's still working on. So I'm very happy to have him here.
Who would like to begin? You're going to do as we did in the last discussion, where someone frame it positive or negative, and then positive, and trading off like that?
Well, why don't I say what I like and what I don't like about the idea of Eros, and then maybe Frank can weigh in on what he likes and doesn't like about it, if there are such things. There's three senses in which I'm very attracted to it. Right? One is as a poetic metaphor for the complexity of how evolution operates in the cosmos. As almost like a placeholder for getting me emotionally involved in studying that stuff. I think there's also a possibility that we could think towards whether or not there is some additional energy or some additional way of thinking about energy that might have consequences for organic development. That's a long history and also a dubious history. And I think there's a sense in which we could think about the preconditions of reality as having a slant or a skewing, which makes certain kinds of evolutionary trajectories more probable than they otherwise might be. And those three ideas are the different ways that I interpret and validate Wilber's commentary on that subject so that it makes sense for me. And I think for me, it's got to come a little closer to the evolutionary science story than Wilber usually articulates. I think Wilber's ideas are probably a little sharper than his actual articulation, but I definitely see in his articulation a penchant for a dismissive, denigrating attitude towards some of the findings of the sciences. And that phraseology makes me a little bit uncomfortable, and the sense of imagining a force coming in from outside the system, as if science can't possibly explain it, and a special God who loves evolution has to enter the picture and make it happen to make up the difference. I don't like that idea. No, like I was saying, there are ways that I can validate Eros models in my own mind. That sense that there even is an outside of the system for something to come in from, to me is a metaphor of danger. To say it's kind of opens us up to nihilism at the level of cognition, because that space outside of reality is non-space. I don't think it should enter our cognitive models. So generally that kind of, when the poetry slants toward a metaphysics in which people are inclined to up the idea if something was coming in from nowhere to just make it happen, that makes me very uncomfortable with the phrasing.
Yeah. Can I respond directly?
Yeah, please.
So yeah, Eros, is it a theory, is it a meta-theory, or is it a metaphor? I've written an essay on that. For me, it's completely unclear what Wilber has in mind and the way he employs the term Eros, often in the context of scientific debates about what is empirically probable and isn't probable, muddles the waters even more. I have nothing against poetry if it's clear from the start that it's meant to be poetry. But if it's mixed with empirical questions, then it is basically without meaning to me. You mentioned the complexity and the diversity of reality. Of course, that is the challenge for all parties involved to explain that. The particular explanation of Wilber is positing an Eros in the cosmos, and that is what I'm questioning. I'm never questioning the complexity, not even the sequence of going from simple atoms to complex human brains. That is not the issue. The issue is, do we make any progress in clarifying this process by introducing such an entity, whatever it might be? My answer is no, because there are, in almost all cases which Wilber uses as example, so many more interesting scientific, reductionistic, if you want, explanations at hand, that it becomes for me a meaningless exercise to repeat again and again, there's Eros in the cosmos. In fact, I see that as a romantic ideology that is repeated again and again and never challenged, never even reflected upon. Yeah, that's how I see it. So Wilber, instead of presenting an evolutionary theory, he has an evolutionary theology. And that's basically how I see it now. It doesn't mean that it's value, it is what it is, but we should be clear about what it is and not mixing it with empirical questions.
I agree. I think there's a lot of unclarity about the boundaries of what these discussions are. You know, and when the topic of integral theory and the mode of discussing integrative meta-theories in general is such an umbrella concept, the idea of meta-theories in general, that it's hard to know what you should focus on and what you shouldn't, and to keep things from blending into each other. You have this idea that you're going to bring all these disciplines together and look at their correlations, then it's very easy to get crossover and mission creep and get them entangled with each other. So I think we have to do more work in teasing those things apart and seeing what kind of phrasing and what kind of thinking we're bringing to each area. And it might be that that's a real role that integrative meta-theory could have, right? To be a cultivator and a gardener and a custodian of how different domains relate to each other. But in order to do that, we have to become much more skilled at it than we are now. I do think that, you know, and I think Wilber does have a kind of Pope-like role for a lot of people that he's had for a few decades now. Right? He's an older guy, and I don't know that these questions we're discussing are even of interest to him. But definitely, if you listen to his dialogue, his popular discourses over the last few days, you get a lot of repetition, and you get a lot of confusion about what's science and what's not science. I agree with that.
I tried to spell that out in a paper I presented in, I believe, 2010 at the Integral Theory Conference, and it was called The Spirit of Evolution Reconsidered. Basically, there was zero response on that paper, except, I believe, one peer reviewer who said, yeah, but what is his own alternative? That was for me a sign that basically there is no scholarship and no expertise within the integral community about this particular topic. That would be okay if evolutionary science was just another science, right? Ken Wilber in no way needs to be an expert in all the sciences. That's not the issue. The issue is that the central metaphor for integral theory, evolution, is taken up from a field of science in which he has shown to have almost no expertise. For me, that's an odd thing. I could be wrong, I could be right, but it is definitely something that should be looked at from all sides. But the lukewarm response to this topic has always puzzled me. Is it because the expertise is missing, or the trust, or that most integralists are, in fact, psychologists, therapists, consultants, looking for the next stage of evolution, becoming a field quiet, blah, blah, blah? Or do they really want to investigate the interface of integral with science? Wilber has a theory of everything. It includes science specifically. In SES, it also includes complexity science and all that. Where is the second reading that should be given to all this material? I have not been able to spot anywhere.
No, I don't see
When in the latest book on Trump, evolution turned out to have even political, strategic expertise. That was really the limit for me, that evolution was got stuck and it had to remobilize and change its course and blah, blah, blah. Of course, we can say again that's metaphor, and it might even be an enlightening metaphor, but then be specific about it and don't claim that this same evolution is a force in the cosmos that is working against entropy and chance, and as if it's a real effective energy. I think that's completely mixed up in the rhetoric Wilber uses, and the fact that he is not willing to qualify it or specify it, he just repeats it, and it is that is the sign for me that it's an ideology by definition.
I think that the concepts of Eros have not been formulated in such a way that they can approach the science yet, right? But the thinking on this subject hasn't formulated clearly enough to even see that it could move toward hypotheses, which is what it would have to do in order to try to enter in and integrate with the field of science. I think there are ways that might be possible down the road, like depending on what we mean by Eros and spirit, right? There's a long tradition of the idea that there might be some additional energy that is exploited by or is particularly useful for organisms and guides them in a particular direction. Now, there's been a whole bunch of fanciful thinking on that subject. It's not out of the question that that could be a hypothesis that could be verified, but it would first have to be formulated in those terms. And likewise, the idea that the cosmos itself, reality itself, outside of the terrain of biological evolution, contains certain patterns and certain structures that skew changes over time in a particular direction. That might be a scientifically verifiable hypothesis, but it would first have to be formulated as such, and we would first have to want to formulate it as such. And that's where I see the holdup for a lot of people is, a lot of people are happy with the way it have been phrased. They don't want to do work to clarify it, and they don't think they should have to try to formulate it to meet science's requirements. And maybe they don't, but somebody should. I think there is a potential there. It doesn't have to be left as misleading abstraction and muddled metaphors.
Yeah, but Wilber explicitly links the concept of spirit or eros to, in fact, all of evolution. In the Religion of Tomorrow, he says the very fact that there is evolution from the atom to the molecule to the human brain is proof of spirit. I mean, there's no mincing of words here. It is not like that he says there might be a subtle energy somewhere and perhaps in the future we can detect it. No, without this spirit there would be no complexity. We would still be atoms. That's how I read him. And in fact, every time he repeats this argument, it is as if every complexity for him is a mystery. Now he says, hey, then there were molecules, and then a boundary dropped around it and they became cells. He's mystifying every step in the process. Now compare this to science, which doesn't have all the answers, but at least has the humility to say, we break the whole process up in steps and we study how molecules form from atoms or cells form from molecules. And then it becomes interesting. And nobody in the field of science says, hey, wait a minute, you need spirit to explain all that. That is ridiculous. Same in biology. There are species, there are eyes and wings. Nobody in the field, as much controversy as there is in the field of biology, nobody says you need spirit. Except, of course, you are a creationist or an intelligent design adherent. Yeah, then you have in the back of your mind the idea that science will never find the answers, and my particular God is the explanation. And Wilber is a creationist, as far as I'm concerned. The only difference is his God is different than Jehovah. But in terms of logic and argument, he is a creationist. And he misses science, even says intelligent design is correct as to the criticism of Darwinism. He doesn't even consider that Darwinism might have been expanded into other schools of thought. There are many different streams in the domain of biology, and there is a huge controversy about how much weight should we give to natural selection, etc. But that's a naturalistic discussion. Wilbur says, oh, intelligent design has solved that problem for me because they point out the huge holes in this theory. The only minor objection he has towards intelligent design is that his idea of God is, of course, much more sophisticated. But if he could replace Jehovah with emptiness, then the problem would be solved for him. Now that is a sign for me that he has completely missed what science is and what it actually has provided in terms of insight, solutions, theories. He glosses over all that because he has the answer already in the back of his mind. And that's his religion, and it's fine. I grant everybody his own religion, but he should not mix that with science. Well, anyway, don't make me start.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, the field of evolution, because the word has different meanings on different scales. I think that a lot of the time, a guy like Wilbur, or like a lot of people in integral or integral-like communities, get mixed up between the specific use of the term in terms of the evolutionary sciences, and a very broad use of the term which could describe the philosophical logic of the fact of changes all in existence, and something else which is like a more specific subset of the evolutionary process. And I think that's one of the things I hear in Wilbur a lot is a conflation between a subset of evolution and the general evolution.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, we could use horizontal and vertical, it doesn't really matter. A lot of evolution, most of evolution, especially in the neo-Darwinian sense, is adaptation to reproductive niches. Mm-hmm. You're not necessarily getting any progress in terms of complexity and consciousness in those adaptations. And so when he talks about this progress, he talks about these holons, and he's very interested in the tetra-enfoldment of these things. I think most of the time he's actually thinking of a very narrow subset of the evolutionary process and speaking of it as if it's the entire evolutionary process. Mm-hmm. I think what he's interested in is...
We have a shortage of terms for this. Because, how should we call the fact that planets emerge, that stars emerge? Okay, if we call that evolution, in fact, that's fine, as long as he doesn't do like he did with biological evolution, and that is posit some internal drive towards complexity in nature, and hey, there are the planets and the stars. And that's begging the question big time for me, because there are solid and sound scientific explanations for how planets emerge. I mean, where to begin? But if you paint everything with a broad brush and make it a kind of spiritual philosophy by saying there's an Eros in the cosmos, in fact you can explain everything, but it gives you the illusion of understanding. It's not real understanding, to me.
No, I think there's
Each of these fields are interesting. I mean, you can wake me up for any scientific problem, but you need to provide clarity instead of pretending you have an explanation. It becomes more complicated if spiritually minded people say, hey, but my third eye has opened and I see that Wilbur is right. That's a totally different debate, of course, because it just suggests my third eye is blind or myopic. But I don't mind whatever the source of the knowledge is. Does it clarify anything? And in all these cases, I never see any fresh insight on how a species evolve, how wings evolve, to stick to the biology field. So it leaves me pretty neutral if people come up with these spiritual explanations. They just don't explain.
What's your spiritual orientation? And one of the things I want to ask about that is, what's your sense of whether or not there's a subjective correlate to evolution processes. You relate to that, the idea that there's a subjectivity, that there's an internal component, like a yearning that goes along with dynamism.
Yeah, I think the classic example is the giraffe with his long neck. As much as the giraffe wants to have a long neck, trying hard will not give the long neck to its offspring. It just happens to be that it just so happens that those giraffes that have a long neck give their long neck to their offspring, and these have a long neck. You know what I mean? So willing and trying and desiring for the giraffe itself, important enough, but it does not, unless you are a Lamarckian, give that characteristic to your offspring. And in fact, Wilbur is a kind of pre-Darwinian in this respect. At the time of Darwin, almost everybody believed in evolution. His grandfather wrote a book on evolution, but they were transformationists. That means they thought that species morphed into other species by some transformative or mysterious force. In fact, nobody understood. This fits Wilbur's view pretty well. Darwin, by contrast, was a variationist. I have this from Ernst Mayr, the late Ernst Mayr, the classic evolutionist. A variationist says it doesn't happen through internal transformations or interiority or wishes, but purely through the variation in nature, which is always a fact. Selection working on that variation, whatever the sources of that variations are. And that radicality, I believe, Wilbur has never accepted. And it is the same radicality that says you don't need a God to get to species. That's what Darwin said. Wilbur, in fact, reintroduces God by saying, without this spirit, you don't get eyes, you don't get wings. And this is a bit of a minefield, this discussion, because I've challenged him this many times, especially since he wrote in Brief History about evolution, is spirit in action, and then the eyes and wings came up. Okay, then he was challenged, and that's something, give me a break on this. I know the subject inside out. I just wanted to say how complex things are. This is a very weak response because everybody knows things are complex. That is the whole starting point for science, but for him it is the end point. I see him as a transformationist. I found the term in Ernst Mayr's work. I think it's very apt, and he keeps suggesting that, he even mystifies the process. So he says it's a transcend and include. There's a novelty coming from nowhere, an advance, creative advance into novelty, the Whiteheadian term, and that is his explanation for novelty in evolution. Well, there is no scientist who would say that, because it's an unnecessary hypothesis. Things can be explained. The fingers we have are the bones in the fish, the fins of the fishes. They are just reused. It is not that there's a complete novelty there. Well, again, where to begin? So that field is a vast scientific field with so many theories and insights, and Wilbur glosses over it, paints it with a spiritual brush, and sells this as an integration of science and religion. I think it's preposterous.
Yeah, I don't think you need most of the ideas, especially the way he's phrasing them, to understand how evolution is operating. I think obviously most of the design, maybe all of the design, and that's what I'm not sure. It's really hard to get your head around what the actual statistics are. If you have somebody like Wilbur quoting some statistics saying this is completely implausible, there's a long history of people saying it's totally implausible that this would happen, but honestly we don't know how implausible or plausible it isn't, right? Yeah. We're not sure how much we can explain and how much we can't explain. Our orientation should be to be parsimonious and try to explain as much as we can with as few principles as possible.
Yeah, and everybody starts out as a creationist, huh? Because everybody thinks nature is so complex. How could that possibly have evolved? So that initial skepticism is something to overcome, and the resistance towards this is immense.
And everybody starts off with a kind of condensed view of themselves and individual organisms, because that's what we see and encounter. It's much more difficult to start thinking about the other scales that are going on. It turns out that the evolution is mostly the viral gene packets and not so much the organisms. As well as it's hard to branch out and think in terms of your relationships. Right? That even the idea of the four quadrants is a useful way of symbolizing the fact that we have to keep all those things in our mind, because whether it's Darwin's idea that the ecosystem is selecting from among the variations, or Lynn Margulis's kind of ideas that we have genetic communities symbiotically unfolding. These are all relationship-oriented images. Where you have both things. It's hard for people to think in relationships, and to me that is something that an integral thinker should have at the forefront of their mind. It's not to be, there's the organism and what's going on for it and its relationships and its environments. All of these are co-selecting from among the variations that are present. One thing I really like about Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, is that it's indifferent to the sources of the variation, right? And that leaves a lot of room open, right? It could be random mutation, it could be ancient aliens. They would be treated the exact same way, right? I sometimes have this fantasy that's compelling to me emotionally about these spiders that look exactly like leaves on the forest floor. And that is one of those things where you look at it and it's hard emotionally as a human being to take seriously that this is the result of tinkering and selection. And you need to think of these other options. And I can think of those other options. I can even imagine that there's a spider somewhere that almost prays with its whole being and wishes that it was unseen to airborne predators. And if it survives, then maybe its children do that. Maybe 100 times a day for 1 million generations, these spiders pray to the indistinguishable forest floor. I can see how that might have an effect, right? There might be a neo-Lamarckian epigenetic effect on how the genes are organized that modifies their diversity, and then that gets selected for.
I don't think
neo-Darwinian hypothesis is that it doesn't care about that.
Yeah, but you don't have to go that far.
Yeah.
You don't have to go that far. I also have a couple of Meters books of creationists and ID authors, because it's somehow that turns me on to read all this literature. And I've tried a classification to make that if you introduce interiority or a spiritual factor, you can say, okay, it is the organism itself that is a factor. So the giraffe wants to have a long neck. There's even a creationist, Barry Marshall, he says, organisms can change their own genes. That is the natural genetic engineering, as it is called. That's a bit of a fringe, but it is a scientific subject. But the moment you say this spiritual factor is some cosmic or divine generic upward drive, then you run into so many questions. Like, first, that drive is far too generic to create specific complexity. Second, why is that drive active on Earth and working only under very specific conditions and not on the Moon and not on Pluto? See what I mean? Or if it is a God, why did God choose this Earth? These are all theological questions you run into, and I think they are not interesting, because it's just your own fabricated universe of meaning you walk into, but there are much simpler answers to these questions.
I get turned on by the theological and philosophical aspect of it myself, and I don't know. I can't say how much direct impact it might have on any particular field of science. Maybe none. But I can see a picture in my mind that's a little bit Einsteinian, in the sense that Einstein said, hey, with gravity, you've got something that looks like a force, right? It seems to be like an energy, it acts locally, but really it's not like that at all. It's a field, it's omnipresent, infinitely extended, it has local effects, it works where it has the opportunity to work. It's built into the geometry of the universe, and that geometry at the level of almost purely syntactical mathematical structures lends something like an energy to a local circumstance. Right? If I'm up in the air, I have a certain potential energy. I didn't really get an energy added to me. It's just that the shape of reality at that point, locally, relative to the other local things, gives me an abstract quantity that's exchangeable as if it was an energy. And so I can see a picture in which the tactical layout of the universe is slanted in such a way that under certain conditions, it gives a force-like exchangeable quantity that's like an energy, maybe even in tiny amounts, to phenomena that are occurring. Right? That's, I think that's something that might be testable down the line. I don't think it's totally implausible, but I'm not sure whether it's needed or not within the general field of evolutionary science. Maybe you can do 99.99% of all evolutionary science and never go anywhere near that stuff.
Yeah, okay. You introduce a cosmic solution for a local problem. Economy prescribes that you first look at local solutions. Absolute selection is so elegant that without any cosmic governance or supervising deity or impetus or drive, things get fine-tuned. This is almost an unbelievable simplicity. Of course, you can be skeptical and say, well, yeah, natural selection can do some stuff, but not all the way. That is, of course, the skepticism that Wilber also voices. Yeah, it's fine to have some variation, I accept all that, I include it, but not a reductionism, and I still need my God and my spirit. But in fact, if you read Darwin carefully, it's exactly the precise fine-tuning and adaptations. That's why it is called adaptations. These changes are adapted to environments, and nobody has to supervise. This is a magnificent, simple explanation which does away with all these extra cosmic, extraterrestrial, whatever unspecified influences. For me, that belongs to the Flat Earth Society era, when the sky above us had some stars and everything was simple and must have been created. We live in a different universe. I'm not sure about that. I mean, it's easy to get mixed up when people are trying to think in bigger pictures. It's easy for them to get that stuff mixed up, especially in the phrasing, with things that are pre-rational, Flat Earth Society kind of stuff. Like, if you want to ask a purely philosophical, right? If people want to sit down and go, why is it that the number 4 is different than the number 5? These are extraordinarily abstract questions that apply to the whole universe. Now, they're relevant to sciences because sciences need to be able to draw on them. They're not necessarily pre-rational just because they're cosmic and abstract. There are advanced cosmic and abstract things, and I think every philosophy, I think mathematics is like that. It's to some degree cosmic and totally abstract. It has a role in the local circumstance, but it would be easy to exaggerate that role if we started thinking of numbers as having agency and trying to determine the outcomes. So it's a slippery slope back and forth. I think it's easy to be dismissive, but it's also easy to get confused if you're thinking on those topics, slide backwards toward flat earth kind of stuff. Yeah, but I'm afraid I've lost you now. So what is it you want to explain? Instead of saying there might be this and there might be that, what specifically does it clarify? That's always my point of view.
Well,
perhaps, well, we could take Stuart Kaufman as an example. Okay. Wilber also points to that. He says, I'm not alone in criticizing Darwinism because Stuart Kaufman says we also need self-organization. That's true. In fact, that's correct. The thing is, these are not competitors. It's not that instead of natural selection creating a giraffe, now all of a sudden self-organization creates the giraffe. No, self-organization works at a much higher taxonomic level. For example, how is a cell formed? That is self-organization, like the fat bubbles in your soup. That is self-organization. That is a totally different level of analysis. It does say nothing against natural selection. In fact, it shows how much evolutionary science has proceeded since the time of Darwin. Darwin was studying species. Well, species is the lowest level of taxonomy. There are 6, 7, 8 levels above it. Lynn Margulis studied the kingdoms, plants and animals. Carl Woese studied the bacteria and the beings with a nucleus. Life itself is studied by Stuart Kaufman. How does life as a cell form? So all these levels are studied, but none is a refutation of Darwin. And I think Wilber is very disingenuous here, because he throws around names like Stuart Kaufman, self-organization. Here you have my Eros. come on people, this needs a whole lot of better analysis than Wilber provides even to this very day. And not to mention Prigozhin, the thermodynamics guy, Order Out of Chaos. He seems to think that just saying a book title, Order Out of Chaos, proves my spiritual universe. Again, I say, come on. These people were naturalists, they were atheists. Even Stuart Kaufman is a naturalistic religious person. Does not need any spirit, immanent or whatever inserted into matter to get your complexity. They know better. Don't make me start.
Yeah, I agree with that in a lot of ways. I mean, I think of sacred naturalism is pretty close to how I would describe myself. And I see some increase in Wilber in general on a number of topics. Seems a little bit reluctant about that. Like, I heard him the other day describing flow states as a form of spirituality or enlightenment relative only to the gross realm. You know, nature mysticism, which will be transcended by subtle and causal and non-dual mysticism. Now, I tend to think of those things as simultaneous and co-present with each other rather than stacked. And so I don't think of the life world in the gross realm as being particularly lower. And I think there is a tendency in his phraseology to move away from naturalism when we don't need to do that. We take all of those ideas, wherever they're reasonably valid, consider them to be aspects of naturalism and look toward other forms of rich and evolving naturalistic study to flesh that out for us, assist us in a kind of a complementary cathedral of sciences of naturalism.
I've lost you.
Okay.
The subtle and the causal. A step away from naturalism.
Yeah, I think so. Wilber would do, you know, like there's an enlightenment of you being one with the material universe.
Yeah.
Then there's an enlightenment of you being one with the subtle universe, and these are getting bigger in that sense. I don't really think of it like that myself. I think there's a tendency in his thinking to move away from the natural and away from the material. An old school philosopher's tendency. And I think there's that tendency. He doesn't think of naturalism as being as deep and rich as it could be. Right? The natural environment, naturalism could, the area in which all of these dimensions come together, rather than like a low level that has to be transcended in order to incorporate all these dimensions.
Okay, a wider view of nature.
Yeah, a wider, deeper, richer view of nature can do the things that I think he wants it to do, but we don't have to go away from nature to do that.
Yeah. I came across this sentence from Kaufman that he said, I'm not a mysticist. I have, in fact, a physics of biology, but this is good enough for me. And this is where I draw the line, that he only accepts physical reality, but is in admiration and awe of that enormous complex reality. And for the rest, of course, he has his own mind and experience. I don't think he has an explanation for that. Wilber, in turn, makes a lot of inner reality and how that might correspond to outer realities, like the subtle and the causal or whatever. I myself, 20 years ago, I was really fascinated by all that. I thought, well, this is a really mapped universe. At the moment, I think this is fine as a description of internal realities, but I have no way of seeing this explains anything in the outside world. So whatever you want to interpret this as a separate reality or an internal reality or whatever, I don't know, but we should keep that out of the discussion if we focus on evolution.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things, if we have a question like, are there any useful intersections between sciences, particularly evolutionary sciences, and integral thinking? One of the possible intersections is, what does evolution look like if reality is structured the way integral theory says it's structured? And I don't know how much we need that or not, but one of the questions we could ask ourselves is, if the universe is a four-quadrant affair, if there are these other states, right? If there are these things, that should show up in the adaptation process. We looked at it in a rich fashion. right? That the factors that are part of the niche to which any system is adapting, if whatever those factors are, however many dimensions exist within that niche, they may contain factors that those things are adapting to. Maybe that adaptation is very small, that we don't need to take it into consideration. It may be that it's not there, or it may be that a good formulation of those things would explain some things about the adaptation that might otherwise seem murky to us. But we couldn't get anywhere near that unless we formulated it in a way that was more congruent with the sciences.
I think we should separate the four quadrants from the notion of Eros. We could even skip Eros and keep the quadrants. And then still we have a nice way of classifying theories of evolution. That's fine with me. But the moment you say, but now I know the dynamic behind it, which actually turns atoms into human beings, and that is an Eros in the cosmos, that has nothing to do with the four quadrants, in my opinion. That is an esoteric mythology of involution and evolution. 30, 40 years ago, I believed in all that, and I wrote a book, 7 Spheres, about this. I liked it immensely until I started drilling into it and asking questions and asking for specifics. And then it just didn't hold up. Because again, if you say evolution is driven because there has been an involution for it, and it all comes from spirit, and we go back to spirit, and spirit pulls us back. This is a whole dynamic that we don't need. It's fascinating, and it's uplifting, and it gives meaning, no doubt about it. But it does not explain evolution. It's an outmoded cosmology, and I've tried to, in my review of Religion of Tomorrow, I've tried to spell that out again with almost zero ripples or challenges or even adaptations from the integral. I don't understand this. Is it just then a matter of broadcasting and selling an ideology and Wilbur, letting Wilbur explain this until his last day of life? Is that what we want? Or do we, after 40 years of writing by Wilbur, really want to take a critical look at it and see if it holds true?
It's hard to tell. It may be that a lot of people, whether they know it or not, are waiting for him to die before they take their own thinking to the next stage.
Yeah, okay, let other people do it then.
Yeah.
But allow them, invite them, facilitate them. And that's not what I see happening.
No, and this is all over. Like, I think there are areas where the integral community, which is only a community in a partial sense, and everybody's busy with their own lives and their own thinking, so there's not time and energy for everybody to go down each channel and check everything out. It seems to me there are 2 areas in particular, like the right-hand quadrant, so to speak, where there's been a little bit of weakness, and everybody kind of acknowledges that. Because, yes, it's been attractive to a lot of spiritual and psychotherapeutically oriented people.
Yeah.
However, this complaint that it's not working as well as it could with the material sciences, and the complaint that it's not being critical enough when it comes to socioeconomic affairs, I think those are very valid, and those are areas we have to get into more richly going forward.
Yeah, I've compared it to a zeppelin. It's a huge, interesting, colorful thing, but it's floating in the air. So where is the grounding in both society and in science?
Yeah, and I know you feel like your critiques haven't been engaged with very well, and I can understand why that hasn't happened, but I think they need to be, because I think, like you're saying, that Zeppelin quality has to be counteracted. There has to be a better interface with solidity, with things on the ground, right? A more grounded integral theory that's better interfaced with social critique, that's better interfaced with the material sciences. That's what we need going forward.
Yeah.
We've all got to get there somehow, and it's going to take a while, obviously. It takes time for anybody to work through any little piece.
And I know, but time is running out a little bit. If you start writing in the 70s is a long time ago. And we have had conferences and journals, and we have online Integral Naked, Integral Life, Integral this and Integral that. And I only see a kind of promoting a new religion. Yeah, the religion of tomorrow, probably. Well, which is fine.
What's your fantasy there, Frank? What would you love to see happen? What's your best case scenario?
I think an openness, even an eagerness to hear challenges and to reflect on them, and not to say, oh, this comes from a green level or this is orange. Recently Wilbur said, I'm constantly being criticized by Frank Visser, who is extremely conventional. Well, I think Interval has to aspire to the level of being conventional instead of thinking that it might go down to that level, because it's nowhere near the conventional levels of being honest with your theories and your critics. And I mean, in science, you cannot do without critics. And we've had the whole Wyatt Earp episode. Well, that's a different story. For me, that showed one thing, that Integral has an unhealthy relationship to its critics. It's fine to dismiss them and to ridicule them, and it's great if you want to build a cult, but if you want to be taken seriously by scientists, this is not the way to, and certainly not the way to emulate it or to glorify it or to whatever. Take it as an example of good behavior. It's a shame, nothing less. But anyway, I was personally involved in this, of course, and again, I was really puzzled how Wyatt Earp was experienced in the community, and so many people were against, so many people were in favor, but in the end, it didn't change anything, because we had an Integral Institute, and we had advanced courses, and we had artists, and all the famous people who joined. See, that's the bandwagon I've not been into since the year 2000.
Can I interject here?
Yeah.
It'll take us back a few minutes, but I've been noticing a few things that I think would be nice to clarify and maybe bring things together also as we continue. So the three basic questions here. One is talking about when Layman was making his appeals to like a broader cosmic picture, and you were asking what does that explain locally and what's the value of that. And one question I have that I'd like to hear your perspective on, Frank, something like the claim of Stephen Hawking that if the Big Bang Theory is true, if the universe had expanded 1 trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of 1% faster or slower, a universe that would be capable of sustaining stars would not have been possible. And without the evolution of stars, without the emergence of stars, then the heavy elements that comprise all of life would not have been possible. And I don't think it's necessary to describe that in terms of spirit, but I think it does point to the fact that you can't really neatly disentangle the global and the local at the ontological level. Yeah. I think for science, epistemologically, the local focus is very useful. Mm-hmm. And there are good reasons possibly to bracket out the global if basically whatever the global delivers can be taken as a given.
Oh, I agree. I fully agree. The thing is, in big history, they have analyzed this in a magnificent way. They have reconstructed this whole process of the generation of the heavy elements and the stars and the planet. Even in our own bodies, we have these elements. They come from star explosion. In that sense, we are connected to the cosmos. But at no point is there a transcendental step. And Wilbur is tempted, this transcendental temptation, whenever he encounters a complexity, to see a mystery.
Right, and that connects to the other point I wanted to bring in here. I wanted to ask Layman to clarify his reframing of the classification or the terms of gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual, and how those might be viewed in a more naturalistic way, which would not necessarily involve some mysterious, extra-worldly, transcendental force. It might be more locally, as maybe Latour talks about, with every emergence being a local transcendence. There is a transcendence that happens at really every step. Pascal or Latour would talk about that in a naturalistic way. So I wanted to ask Layman if he could fold in what he means by gross, subtle, and causal, and you could bring in non-dual. That would possibly give a more naturalistic framing of popular integral terms that would not introduce the Mysterianism, that is a right.
Well, I mean, there's a tendency to think of these as the states of consciousness experienced internally by the meditator. There's an old tradition of talking about them in that way, and Wilber often brings them forth in that sense. The causal is me as the witness, subtle is my subtle body, and things like that. And what I think is that's a slice of what the phenomenon is, in my impression, right? That it's in all the quadrants, but it just looks different when you talk about it outside of a mystical context, right? To me, the causal dimension, for example, experienced internally is something like an immaterial, unchanging aspect of how you're looking at things. But externally, there's something like that as well. We call it logic or mathematics, right? It doesn't have mass, doesn't have subtle flavor or color. It's presumably eternal. It can be accessed everywhere. So to me, that's an external extension of the causal, right? So I think of the causal as a sort of the invisible, n-dimensional, syntactical set of presuppositions which allow any universe to operate. And I think of the subtle in terms of anything which has particular character and flavor, but which is not quite the same as the syntax or substance. And non-duality is the principle of being which allows those different facets to interact with each other. None of them is more primary or more transcendental. They're all just things that we need in order to think about any given situation. Right? Like if you didn't think that there was some kind of logical structure, which is equivalent to the witness in a sense. The witness is a logical structure type argument about your consciousness. But you need that, and you also need substances. And substances and logic need to interact somehow, so there needs to be a principle of their interoperability, which is non-duality in a sense. So that tends to be the way I hold it. And so I think you could say at any given instance that you couldn't think about it completely without all those aspects. However, you don't need to think about all those aspects in order to think about that situation clearly from a particular point of view. And so if you're doing evolutionary science, is it significant that you need to think about the nature of syntax? Right? Where is the justification for logic and number and perception coming from? You don't really need to think about that too much, or it's unclear if you do or if you don't.
Yeah.
So I think that you can do away with most of that when you focus on a particular domain of inquiry, such as evolutionary biology.
Yeah. Well, Wilber has somewhere a nice, I believe in his piece responding to critical realism, that he says physics has gone to various stages with the atom and the quantum theory and then string theory. The same can be done for biology. You could have an orange survival of the fittest and a green cooperation biology, and then you get the teal tree of life, which has all the genealogy relationships, and then you might even have a turquoise horizontal gene transfer or what have you. So that complicates the tree even more. It's fine with me. It's playful. It could be right or wrong. It doesn't detract from the fact that all the significant discoveries in that field have been done by reductionistic means. Lynn Margulis, peering through her microscope, saw the cell walls of the bacteria and the mitochondria. Carl Rose, investigating the bacteria, he used reductionistic science. I mean, all this talk about orange being reductionistic, what I'm saying is we might hope to reach that level instead of look down on it.
I agree, and I think that reductionism can get a bad name in the integral community, because one of the things you're trying to do with a meta theory is to validate a whole bunch of different domains and lenses simultaneously. So when you say we're against reductionism, you mean don't throw out this domain by virtue of looking at this domain. We're against reductionism in that sense, but within a particular domain, reductionism is a very beautiful and powerful thing, which we see that in the material sciences. Right, there was a tremendous jump in human knowledge gathering capacity that occurred over the last few hundred years. It was accompanied by, in my mind, it's a double checking, right? You double check your thinking, that's reason. You double check your evidence, right? That's testing. And it's like Darwinism in the sense that it's this gate, that things have to pass through this particular validating criteria in order to move forward. In Darwinism, it's living long enough to reproduce yourself into fertile offspring. But that's only one example of setting a higher standard for what information can pass through to continue. And I think that the sciences give us a good model of a positive reductionism, where we should try to undercut our models. We should try to set a higher standard for which things can go forward with us and which could get deselected for because they're not adaptive to the project in any domain of inquiry. So I think that the Orange Revolution, which did so much for us in the external material sciences, is something that we haven't matched in a lot of the other areas, right? I don't see that most mystics have gotten up to the level of Orange in their mysticism. I don't see that a lot of people's experience of their own psychology is up to the level of Orange. And so I think a lot of people who view scientific materialism as reductionist, and partly because the other domains that they want to validate aren't up to that standard yet. And they don't really know how to get there. And they're a little bit defensive against the success of scientific materialism. And I think the solution to that, trying to make a similar growth, a similar, more rigorous validation process with other domains so that they can get together and go forward.
But it's science knows how to get there. It's integral that doesn't know how to get there in these external domains.
Well, I think science does know how to get there in a lot of areas. It doesn't mean every scientist does, but in principle, science does. And I think the integral argument ought to be that how can we export that into other domains that we don't normally associate with the sciences? How can we do a similar form of increased rigor and then see what we have after that? And so that's what I would look for. That's what I think integral ought to be looking at. And maybe we are being held back by the ongoing argument of Ken Wilber, even if that was very useful to us in the past. Those are great ideas. There's only one way to go at those ideas, but somehow we've all got to go forward together.
Yeah, absolutely true.
The Henrik Skolimowski, he talks about something which scientists don't need at all, but it might make this stepping up to Orange more palatable in other contexts, in a sense, which he calls it the yoga objectivity, and seeing it as an actual incredibly disciplined practice, a form of actually achieving a kind of union with the object. And it's a profound practice that actually is not enacted in many domains, and he calls for basically learning the yoga of objectivity within the interior domains in a similar, or within some of the other quadrant domains, that we could begin to enact that in these other areas. Again, science doesn't need to refer to anything or validate anything by calling it a yoga, but people in those other domains, especially in spiritual communities like integral, that has an appeal to it, and a reframing so that they can really feel like this is actually a valuable path to follow, rather than, this is some step that I might think that would be an abandonment of my spiritual principles or whatever. But one thing I wanted to, the third question I wanted to add, which is, we've been using the term Eros, and we've mentioned that it's, whether it's poetic or whether it's an actual force. I would like to ask if, especially Layman, if you would offer any definition of Eros that you think is valuable, and that would allow us to retain the term, or, as in our previous dialogue, is it a holdover from old metaphysics that we could just as well do without?
I think it's a matter of lazy thinking. Take the example of the heavy elements. Now, it was for a long time a mystery how have all these elements that in the 19th century in the periodical system were named, how did they emerge? Now, one could tell a perfectly integral story here. Wilber has done that in one of the Interspiritual Center talks, and say, well, from hydrogen to helium to lithium to all the other ones, you see a pattern of trend-patterning clue. And every next element brings new characteristics. True, but does it explain how the elements were formed? Not at all, because only by seeing gravity doing its work of compression and star explosions and a lot of heat, could it be made understandable how to get heavy elements? And it is not even that simple, because there were steps in that sequence that could not be explained even by gravity. And then you had to resort to quantum tunneling and what have you, until all these steps were explained. Now, if I have to choose between an uplifting, fascinating story about transcendent include and then creative advance into novelty, or a scientific story that has taken decades to be clarified, but in the end it was found, the answer was found, then I have no difficulty choosing science. See what I mean? This is a very small, of course, a very materialistic example. Integral has much more, it's not specialized in chemistry, I know that, but since Wilbur is extending his ideas to a theory of everything, I do feel justified to take it as an example. And it also shows a huge contrast between the excitement of discoveries in science and the almost, how to say that, hypnotizing quality that the interconcepts can have. It gives the illusion of insight and understanding, but it gives none whatsoever a real explanation. It's descriptive at most.
Yeah, I agree. It's primarily used as a descriptive rather than as an explanatory principle. Even though when people talk, that shifts and it sounds like you're making an explanatory argument when they're really describing a tendency that's observable. Mm-hmm. To Bruce's point, and I think I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning of the talk, for me there's sort of three kinds of Eros. Right? One is more as a poetic placeholder for all the interesting and ongoingly explored aspects of complex phenomena. And that if that's what it is, if it reminds us and it is evocative, it's emotional, and we always know that it directs us toward rigorous exploration, then the poetic concept is great. And if it seals itself off and withdraws from the actual discipline, from the yoga of the exploration, then it's problematic. So that's what Eros means to me in the first sense. The second sense, in which there may be Eros and Thanatos, in which Eros is only one of the spirits, so to speak, and not spirit in general. It's confusing in Wilbur's work whether Thanatos is still a player for him now, like it was in his books from the 70s. But I can see a situation, I can imagine, for example, that there could be a spectrum of massless energy of which some of it interacts with organisms in a way that tends to help them out a little bit, and another part of that spectrum tends to interact with organisms in a way that breaks down. And so there could be an Eros and a Thanatos in terms of some actual local energy dynamics. I don't know if you need that explanation or not, but at the level of subtle energies, it's possible, but it's only possible if we think it through in a scientific way. For me, the most interesting part of what Eros could be is whether or not there's a probability skewing to reality in general. And I think this is where Wilbur's argument, or what's really underlying Wilbur's argument, is his view of probability. Right? Because he also thinks in terms of Sheldrake's morphogenetic field theory, the idea that certain patterns lay a groove down that make that groove more probable over time. And so he's thinking of things that alter probability. It's an underlying aspect of his thinking. I'm not sure where I stand on that. But I think that in local situations, whether it's a form that's been practiced and causes a slight tilt in the direction of that form repeating, or whether it's applied to the whole universe, where something like the convergence of all the basic parameters of the universe end up pointing in a particular direction, and that direction skews chance in that direction a little bit. I think those are both possible, but we would have to really examine that in a rigorous way.
I still want to ask you, what do you want to explain? I mean, if there's one giraffe, it's easy to get more giraffes? Well, there are easier explanations for that than morphogenetic theory.
Well,
I'm serious.
That's what you mean by easier, right? There's an easier explanation in terms of the discipline of the material sciences.
Yes.
But when the insular person is thinking, they're also thinking about, like, philosophy. They're thinking of all these different domains simultaneously.
Yeah, but you make it so overly complicated, and it's not clear to me what is the added value. That's the burden.
I'm not sure I know what the added value is. I think when you come up with a possibility that might apply to many different domains, that's a philosophical possibility initially, or it could be a fantasy. The responsibility is on you at that point. If you want to try to bring that forward in a particular domain and frame it in a way that it could be understood in that domain. And I think a lot of people who see they see an image, right? They see a pattern in vision logic space, whatever that is, right? And in that pattern, there's something like a slope, something like an energy, something like a polarization in the unfolding of change. People see this in their minds. And most of them can't or aren't interested in trying to formulate that in a way that could be a scientific hypothesis. I'm not sure that I am. I'm aware of the fact that it seems to me that it could be, but I'm not sure that it needs to be. Like, I'm not sure how much you actually add to a science, even if that were true. It could be that that's true. What does it add to the field of material evolutionary science? Probably not very much, except as a descriptive mechanism that resonates with other domains of inquiry for people.
Okay. But Wilbur has made it a point from day one to claim that his Eros gives a better explanation than Neo-Darwinism is able to give. So it's not a fancy metaphor of poetry. Up till the religion of tomorrow, you can read that he says, at least this gives a better or a more reasonable explanation of the origin of complexity. And that is the very thing I keep questioning.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that question, because I agree. I don't think his phrasing does justice to the sciences.
Yeah, but he does that for 30 years.
Yeah. Exactly.
In Eye to Eye, he already says the only problem with evolutionary science is that it doesn't take dirt into account, as if that would clarify the matter. And nobody has challenged him on this. Nobody.
Well, I couldn't definitively say no one's challenged him on this, but I think...
you know what they said in the past? Oh, Frank, we have these discussions, but between closed doors.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it does...
Publish them. Then make them public.
So the fact that they are public, I think, is a detriment to us. And the fact that we're not open to criticism, we're not seeking criticism more, I think that's a detriment to us. It's holding us back, for sure. Now, there are things that are of interest when you think about multiple domains and disciplines, and you group them all together. Things that, that are not of interest to any particular science, and may not be relevant to that particular science.
Yeah, I'm well aware that the whole evolution story is limited to a certain domain and a quadrant. Integral might be just a classification game of theories. In that sense, it's a meta theory. And what I don't know if integral at the same time can also pronounce on empirical matters. And
I agree. We should be extremely skeptical about any phraseology that sounds like it is pronouncing on empirical matters.
Because if Wilbur includes developmental models, he pays very close attention to what the scientists in these fields actually say. When Wilbur includes, or in fact excludes evolutionary science, he does not pay attention to what these people actually say. And this very omission tells me something about how skewed he is in fleshing out his own model. And that's fine, because he has his own history and his preferences and his experiences, but he should not pretend to be integral.
No, and going forward, we want to bring in, like, if he has some areas of expertise where he doesn't have to integrate all the domains, overemphasizes or focuses on his areas of expertise, that's great. But we need equivalent expertise from all the other zones in order to take that forward. Okay, we want to go forward.
I've tried to do that for evolutionary science in over 100 essays. It has been a personal project a little bit, which was very rewarding for me, so no complaints. But I would love to see more expertise in the community, and people would just disagree with me, and you know.
We are almost at our time, but I wanted to say, which I think was obscured by what Layman just said, which is thank you. Thank you for doing that work. Also, I wanted to add, Michael Dowd makes a distinction between day language and night language, and I think the level of meta theory, we can use both day language and night language. To me, Eros seems most useful as night languaging for serving meta theoretical purposes, not for serving domain-specific explanatory purposes. We need to clearly differentiate those, which I think, Layman has also articulated. Just because we're close to our end here, I wanted to interject and just ask for any final closing thoughts, if that'd be, if you have a minute or two from each of you.
Okay, you're welcome.
This is great. It's nice to see you and get to know you a little better, Frank. I appreciate the work you're doing. I've articulated several times where I think we should all be going forward. I do think there are a couple of areas where the underlying ideas expressed in integral theory could be scientific hypotheses if they were formulated more clearly, and I think people should work on those formulations and sort of unpack ideas and teasing apart the bits of the phrasing that lead us toward metaphysical thinking and the bits of the phrasing that open us up to possibilities that we could check on and then find out if they're true or not, regardless of the value they have for helping us put all the different domains together in our own mind and being.
Okay. It looks to be a little bit like a solution looking for a problem instead of the other way around. First start with the problem and then find solutions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's, for individuals, that's how we live our lives. In the sciences, it's different. Sciences are a discipline. But in your own life, a lot of what you do is a solution looking for a problem. So we got to juggle those somehow.
Yeah. Okay. Are we still on air? No.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, I believe we've covered it. So yeah, the phrase "evolution is spirit in action" is nice as a slogan. It's hopeless as a theory, and we don't know what's in the middle.
Yeah.
If anything is in the middle, or can be.
This is that. I think that's our question. Is there something in the middle?
Is that the integration of religion and science that Wilbur is trying to forge?
Yeah.
If that is his integration, then I have a doubt about his ability.
There's things I love about his integration, but going forward, I think the integration has to steer a little bit more towards sacred naturalism.
Yeah. I wrote a piece why we need a secular integral. Not meaning that everything should be flat and all, because no, you could have any experience you want. But we should no longer draw conclusions, metaphysical conclusions, based on these experiences. For example, that you experience emptiness in yourself is fine. Why call it the world ground?
Yeah.
Doesn't follow for me. We make way too much from all these internal experiences. Yeah, you can visualize, that is subtle. You can stop your thought, that's causal. So, done. What else do you need? In a secular environment, that is already common knowledge. And look outside to the cosmos and to a flower, and you see enough. And for me, in fact, that is, yeah, you could call it the spirituality. But why even call it the spirituality? For me, fine. I wouldn't even call it sacred, as if you have to call at least something sacred. Why? It's fine as is. Now, perhaps that is already non-dual. I don't know.
Yeah, probably. I mean, people use these words in a lot of different ways. And I think a lot of the ways to use it is just to say that they find something very valuable, that it resonates with them.
Yes. Okay, but that can be anything then.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what would be a better thing? What would be a better thing for people to experience as sacred, right? Like, people who experience the richness of science as sacred, that's a very good thing. That's a step forward in the experience of the sacred from people who just experienced folk concepts as sacred. So we want to keep that trajectory going. as best we can.
I don't know why I definitely know this yearning, because in my 20s I went to India and all that, and I studied the psychology of religion. I've covered all that field. I felt that yearning evaporate over the years, and I'm perfectly fine with that. So it is also a kind of disease almost, that you want to find something behind everything.
Yeah.
I'm more accepting of what is here.
I agree, and I think, like I was saying earlier on, this idea of an outside, I think that's a nihilistic problem in cognition, to me. The idea that there's something behind everything, or that there's something out there that's going to come in here. I think in order to make a good philosophical picture, and even to make a good integral philosophical picture, everything that's real has to be inside already. It has to be part of this system that we're in. It can't come from an imaginary outside place.
Are you an idealist?
It's hard to say. I think realism is ideal.
You need a reality check or an ideality check?
Yeah.
Thank you.